Sarah Chen stood behind the counter of the Morning Brew Cafe, expertly making lattes and cappuccinos as she had done for the past 3 years. Her dark hair was neatly tied back in a ponytail, and her green apron showed small coffee stains from a busy morning rush. At 26, she wasn't where she had imagined herself to be, but she took pride in being the best barista in downtown Manhattan. The morning started like any other. Sarah arrived at 5:30 a.m., prepared the machines, and counted the register before opening. Her coworker, Mike, was running late again, leaving her to handle the morning rush alone. But Sarah didn't mind. She had mastered the art of multitasking. As she served the last customer of the morning rush, her phone buzzed. It was a message from her brother, David. "Surprise, I'm in town for a meeting. We'll pass by Grand Central Station around 11. See you there." Sarah's eyes lit up. She hadn't seen her brother in 6 months since he moved to Chicago for work. Looking at the clock, she saw it was 10:30 a.m. Perfect timing. Her break was coming up at 11. "Mike, can you handle things for 30 minutes? My brother's in town, and I want to say hello." Sarah called out to her coworker, who had finally arrived an hour late. "Sure, it's slow now anyway," Mike replied, still looking sleepy. Sarah quickly removed her apron, grabbed her purse, and headed out. The autumn air was crisp, and leaves danced around her feet as she walked the 3 blocks to Grand Central Station. David had always worn the same style, a navy blue wool coat with brown elbow patches. It was their father's old coat, and David had claimed it when he moved out. The station was crowded as usual, filled with tourists taking photos of the celestial ceiling and commuters rushing to their trains. Sarah checked her phone again. 11:05 a.m. David should be here by now. As she scanned the crowd, her eyes caught sight of a familiar navy blue wool coat with brown elbow patches. The man wearing it was standing near the information booth, his back turned to her. Sarah's heart jumped with excitement. Without thinking twice, she rushed forward. "David," she exclaimed, throwing her arms around the man from behind in a big bear hug. "I can't believe you're really here." But something felt wrong. The man felt taller than her brother, and his cologne was different, more expensive, with notes of sandalwood instead of David's usual sporty scent. The man tensed under her embrace. Slowly, very slowly, the man turned around. Sarah's arms dropped to her sides as her face turned a deep shade of red. This wasn't David at all. Instead, she found herself staring into the surprised face of a complete stranger. The man before her appeared to be in his early 30s, with kind brown eyes and a perfectly trimmed beard. He wore an expensive-looking suit under the coat that was so similar to her brother's, and a gentle smile played at the corners of his mouth. I'm so sorry," Sarah stammered, taking a step back. "I thought you were my brother." "The coat. It looks exactly like his." To her surprise, the stranger chuckled. "Well, this is certainly a unique way to start a conversation," he said, his voice warm and amused. "I don't usually get hugged by strangers in Grand Central Station." Sarah wanted the ground to open up and swallow her whole. "I'm mortified," she managed to say. "My brother has the same coat, and I was supposed to meet him here, and I'm really sorry." "No harm done," the man replied, still smiling. "I'm James, by the way. James Whitaker." Before Sarah could respond, her phone buzzed again. This time it was a message that made her groan. "Sorry, sis. Got held up in traffic. Rain check?" "Everything okay?" James asked, noticing her expression change. "My brother just canceled," Sarah sighed. "I should get back to work." Again, "I'm really sorry about the hug." As she turned to leave, James called out, "Wait, you haven't told me your name." "Sarah," she replied over her shoulder, already walking away quickly. "Sarah Chen, and I really am sorry about the hug." She hurried back to the cafe, her cheeks still burning with embarrassment, unaware that this awkward moment would change her life forever. Behind her, James Whittaker watched her disappear into the crowd, unconsciously touching the spot on his coat where her arms had been, a thoughtful expression on his face. 2 days after the awkward hugging incident, Sarah had almost managed to forget about it. She focused on her work, making coffee after coffee, and tried not to think about those kind brown eyes that had looked at her with such amusement. The memory still made her cheeks burn with embarrassment. The morning rush was just ending when the bell above the cafe door chimed. Sarah looked up from wiping down the counter and froze. There he was, James Whitaker, wearing an expertly tailored gray suit this time, but she would have recognized him anywhere. "Good morning," he said, approaching the counter with a warm smile. "I was hoping I'd find you here, Sarah Chen." Sarah blinked in surprise. You? You were looking for me?" "Well, I figured since you gave me a hug, the least I could do was buy a coffee from you," James replied, his eyes twinkling with humor. "What would you recommend?" "Our house blend is pretty good," Sarah managed to say, trying to maintain her professional composure. "Or if you prefer something stronger, our espresso just won double stars at the city's coffee competition." "I'll trust your judgment," James said. "Surprise me." Sarah nodded and turned to her machines, grateful for the chance to compose herself. As she worked, she could feel his eyes on her, watching as she carefully measured the beans and steamed the milk to perfection. "You seem to really know what you're doing," James observed. 3 years of practice," Sarah replied, carefully creating a perfect Rosetta pattern in the foam. "Coffee is an art form, really. Each cup tells a story." She handed him the latte, and their fingers brushed briefly. Sarah quickly pulled her hand back, nearly causing the cup to spill. James took a sip and his eyes widened. "This is incredible," he said sincerely. "Best coffee I've had in New York." "Thank you," Sarah smiled, finally relaxing a little. It's nice to have customers who appreciate good coffee. Some people just want their caffeine fix and don't care how it tastes. "Speaking of appreciation," James said, pulling out his wallet, "how much do I owe you?" "On the house," Sarah replied quickly. "Consider it an apology for the unexpected hug." James shook his head and placed a $50 bill in the tip jar. "Then consider this a thank you for making my morning more interesting." Before Sarah could protest, Mike emerged from the back room and stopped short at the sight of James. "Mr. Whitaker," he gasped. "The James Whitaker? From Tech Fusion?" Sarah looked between them, confused. "You know each other?" "Everyone in the tech world knows Mr. Whitaker," Mike explained excitedly. "He just sold his startup for billions. It was all over the news last month." The color drained from Sarah's face as realization dawned. She had hugged a billionaire in Grand Central Station without permission. James looked uncomfortable for the first time. "I was hoping to keep that quiet for a bit longer," he said softly, looking at Sarah. "Money changes how people see you." I need to check on something in the back," Sarah mumbled, quickly retreating to the storage room. She leaned against the wall, taking deep breaths. No wonder he wore such expensive suits. No wonder his cologne smelled like it cost more than her monthly rent. A few minutes later, when she finally gathered the courage to return, James was gone. But on the counter was a business card with a handwritten note on the back. "The hug was the most genuine thing that's happened to me since the company sold. Would you like to get coffee somewhere else sometime? James." Sarah picked up the card, running her fingers over the embossed lettering. Mike was practically bouncing with excitement beside her. "Are you going to call him?" he asked eagerly. Sarah looked at the card for a long moment. Part of her wanted to throw it away. What could a billionaire possibly want with a barista? But another part of her remembered the warmth in his eyes, the way he had put her at ease after her embarrassing mistake, and how he had genuinely appreciated her coffee. "I don't know," she answered honestly, but she carefully tucked the card into her pocket anyway. Outside, the autumn wind scattered leaves across the sidewalk, and somewhere in the city, a billionaire was drinking the best coffee he'd ever had, thinking about the girl who had mistakenly hugged him in a train station. A week passed and Sarah still hadn't called the number on James's business card. Every night, she would take it out of her purse, stare at it for a few minutes, then put it back. The card was starting to show wear from how many times she'd handled it. On a particularly busy Thursday morning, Sarah was so focused on making drinks that she almost didn't notice her phone buzzing. During a brief lull, she checked it and found a message from her mother. "Sweetheart, the hospital bills came in. Don't worry about it. I'll figure something out." Sarah's heart sank. Her mother had been battling cancer for the past year, and even with insurance, the medical bills were overwhelming. Sarah had been sending most of her salary home, but it wasn't enough. She was about to respond when the door chimed. "Good morning, Sarah." She looked up to find James standing there, wearing a casual sweater this time instead of his usual suit. He looked different, more approachable, more real. "You didn't call," he said softly. I've been busy, Sarah replied, tucking her phone away. The usual? Actually, I was wondering if you're free for lunch today. My treat. Sarah hesitated. I don't know if that's a good idea. Because I'm rich? James asked directly. Would it help if I told you I still eat pizza with my hands and sometimes forget to do my laundry? Despite herself, Sarah laughed. It's not just that. I have responsibilities, complications in my life. Don't we all? James smiled. Look, it's just lunch. No pressure, no expectations. I promise not to buy the restaurant while we're eating. Sarah looked at him for a long moment, then at Mike, who was frantically nodding behind James's back. Okay, she finally said. My lunch break is at 1 o'clock. When Sarah's break came, she found James waiting outside in a modest Honda Civic, not the luxury car she'd expected. He caught her surprised look. Disappointed it's not a Ferrari? He teased. No, actually, relieved, Sarah admitted as she got in. They drove to a small Italian restaurant tucked away in a quiet neighborhood. The owner, an elderly woman named Maria, greeted James like an old friend. James, finally, you bring a girl, Maria exclaimed, making both of them blush. Over plates of homemade pasta, Sarah found herself relaxing. James told her about growing up in a small town in Ohio, about starting his company in his garage, about how strange it felt when the money suddenly came. Sometimes I miss the simple days, he admitted. When success meant coding something that actually worked, not watching stock prices. Sarah understood. She told him about her own dreams of opening a specialty cafe someday, about her love for creating the perfect cup of coffee. She carefully avoided mentioning her mother's illness or their financial struggles. But James was perceptive. There's something bothering you, he observed. You keep checking your phone. Sarah hesitated, then decided to be honest. My mom's sick. Cancer. The bills came today, and she trailed off, not wanting to say more. James was quiet for a moment. You know, my company started a foundation last year. One of our programs helps families with medical expenses. No, Sarah said firmly. I didn't tell you that to ask for help. I don't want your money, James. He held up his hands in surrender. I respect that, but the foundation exists to help people. It has nothing to do with you and me. Before Sarah could respond, her phone alarm went off. I need to get back to work, she said, standing up. Let me drive you, James offered. The ride back was quiet, both lost in their thoughts. As they pulled up to the cafe, James turned to her. Sarah, I like you. Not because you hugged me in a train station, though that was memorable. I like you because you see me as a person, not a bank account. Would you have dinner with me tomorrow night? Sarah looked at him, really looked at him. Past the wealth, past the success, she saw a kind man who ate pizza with his hands and drove a Honda when he could afford a fleet of sports cars. Yes, she said simply. I would like that. As she walked back into the cafe, Sarah felt lighter somehow. For the first time in a long while, she was looking forward to tomorrow. The dinner date with James turned into weekly dinners, and before Sarah knew it, 2 months had passed. They fell into a comfortable routine. James would pick her up after her shift, and they would explore small, hidden restaurants throughout the city. He never took her to fancy places, seeming to understand that she would feel out of place there. One evening, as they walked through Central Park after dinner, Sarah's phone rang. The hospital's number flashed on the screen, making her heart stop. Mom? Sarah answered, her voice shaking. What's wrong? James watched as Sarah's face went pale. She listened for a few minutes, then ended the call. The cancer has spread, she said quietly, staring at nothing. They want to try a new treatment, but insurance won't cover it. It's experimental. Without thinking, James reached for her hand. How much? Don't. Sarah pulled away. This is exactly why I was hesitant about us. I don't want you to think I'm with you because of money. Sarah, James said firmly, if I had a sick mother and you had the means to help, wouldn't you want to? She didn't answer, just wrapped her arms around herself as tears started falling. James guided her to a nearby bench and sat with her in silence, offering his presence as comfort. Finally, Sarah spoke. $200,000. That's what the treatment costs. James pulled out his phone, but Sarah stopped him. What are you doing? Calling my foundation's medical director, he replied. Remember what I said about the foundation helping families? This is what it's for. But. No buts, James interrupted. This isn't charity, Sarah. This is one human being helping another. Let me do this, not as a rich man, but as someone who cares about you. Sarah watched as James made the call, speaking in quick, efficient terms about getting her mother enrolled in the foundation's program. When he hung up, he turned to her with a gentle smile. It's done. The foundation will cover the treatment. Your mother just needs to sign some papers tomorrow. Sarah burst into tears again, but these were different. Tears of relief, of gratitude, of overwhelming emotion. James held her close, letting her cry into his shoulder. When she calmed down, Sarah looked up at him. Why are you so good to me? Because you're the first person in a long time who liked me before knowing I was rich, James replied honestly. Do you know how rare that is in my world? Everyone wants something from me, investments, connections, favors, but you tried to avoid taking anything from me. Sarah thought about that. It was true. She had resisted his help, even when she desperately needed it. She had wanted to prove she wasn't after his money. There's something else you should know, James continued. I've been offered a position running a new tech initiative in Silicon Valley. They want me to move to California. Sarah's heart sank. Oh, when do you leave? I haven't accepted yet, James said carefully. I wanted to talk to you first. These past 2 months have been the happiest I've had in years. I don't want to lose that. What are you saying? I'm saying I don't want to go to California without you. The initiative can wait, or I can run it from here. But I can't walk away from what we have. Sarah stared at him, stunned. James, that's crazy. You can't give up an opportunity like that for someone you've only known for 2 months. Why not? He challenged. Money doesn't make you happy, Sarah. I learned that the hard way. But you make me happy. You keep me grounded. You remind me what's real. Before Sarah could respond, a light rain began to fall. They quickly stood up, and James wrapped his coat around her shoulders. As they hurried toward his car, Sarah thought about everything. The way they met, their lunches, their dinners, how he never flaunted his wealth, how he helped her mother without making her feel indebted. She thought about how natural it felt to be with him, how he made her laugh, how he listened when she talked about coffee like it was the most interesting topic in the world. Maybe 2 months wasn't too soon after all. Maybe sometimes you just know. The rain fell harder, but neither of them rushed. Some moments are worth getting wet for. Life had taken an unexpected turn for Sarah. Her mother's treatment was progressing well, and her relationship with James was growing stronger each day. But with happiness often comes complications, and Sarah was about to face hers. One morning, while preparing for her shift at the Morning Brew, Sarah opened her social media to find her face plastered across several news websites. The headlines read, Tech billionaire James Whittaker's mystery girl revealed, and from barista to billionaire's girlfriend. The modern Cinderella story. The cafe door chimed, and instead of the usual morning customers, 3 photographers rushed in, cameras flashing. Mike quickly stepped in front of Sarah, trying to shield her. Miss Chen, is it true you're dating James Whittaker? How did you meet? Are you after his money? Sarah stood frozen, overwhelmed by the sudden invasion of her quiet life. Her phone buzzed with a message from James. I'm so sorry. I'm on my way. Within minutes, James arrived, his security team clearing the photographers from the cafe. He looked worried and angry at the same time. Someone leaked our story to the press, he explained, running his hands through his hair in frustration. I should have warned you this might happen. Being with me, it comes with unwanted attention. Sarah nodded numbly, still processing the morning's events. Those headlines. They make me sound like some gold digger who trapped you. You know that's not true, James said firmly. And anyone who matters knows it too. But the damage was done. Over the next few days, Sarah's life became a circus. Photographers followed her to work, to her apartment, even to her mother's hospital. Old classmates she hadn't spoken to in years suddenly called, asking for interviews about her. Someone even offered her money to share private details about James. The final straw came when she visited her mother at the hospital. As she walked into the room, she overheard 2 nurses whispering. That's her, the one dating the billionaire. I heard she arranged their meeting, pretended to mistake him for someone else. Sarah felt sick. Was this what people thought of her? That she had planned everything, calculated every move. That evening, she sat in her small apartment, staring at her phone. The screen showed dozens of missed calls from James. Finally, she picked up when he called again. "Sarah, please talk to me. You've been avoiding me for days." "I can't do this, James," she said quietly. "This isn't my world. I'm not made for cameras and headlines and people questioning my every move." "We can handle this," James insisted. "I'll hire PR people. We can release a statement, set boundaries." "That's exactly it," Sarah interrupted. "In your world, everything needs management and statements and teams of people. I just want to make coffee and take care of my mom and live my life." "Sarah, please." "The foundation's still covering Mom's treatment, right?" she asked suddenly. "Of course. That has nothing to do with us." "Then maybe there shouldn't be an us anymore." The silence on the other end was deafening. Finally, James spoke, his voice rough with emotion. "Is that what you really want?" Sarah looked at the newspaper on her coffee table, her face next to James's in a grainy photo. The headline questioned her motives, her character, her worth. "I want my life back," she whispered. "I'm sorry." She ended the call before he could respond, then curled up on her couch and cried. Her phone buzzed repeatedly with messages from James, but she couldn't bring herself to read them. Later that night, as she tried to sleep, Sarah wondered if she'd made the right choice. She thought about James's kind eyes, his gentle heart, the way he made her feel safe and valued. But then she remembered the photographers, the whispers, the accusations. Sometimes love isn't enough. Sometimes the world that comes with it is too much to bear. As she drifted off to sleep, Sarah didn't know that across town, James sat in his penthouse office, staring at a photo of them from their first dinner date. He had never looked happier than he did in that picture. And now, surrounded by all his wealth and success, he had never felt more alone. The city lights twinkled outside, indifferent to the two hearts breaking in their glow. 2 weeks after Sarah ended things with James, life had settled into a new normal. The photographers gradually lost interest, the headlines faded, and Sarah threw herself into her work at the café. But everything felt different. The coffee didn't smell as rich, the morning sunlight didn't seem as bright, and her smile didn't come as easily. One rainy Tuesday morning, an elegant woman in her 60s walked into the Morning Brew. She carried herself with grace and wore simple but expensive clothes. Sarah noticed her studying the menu with unusual intensity. "Can I help you?" Sarah asked politely. "Are you Sarah Chen?" the woman asked, her voice gentle but direct. Sarah tensed, expecting another reporter. "Yes, I am. I'm Elizabeth Whittaker, James's mother." Sarah's hands trembled slightly as she set down the cup she was holding. "Oh, may I have a few minutes of your time?" Elizabeth asked. "I promise I'm not here to cause trouble." Mike quickly offered to cover the counter, and Sarah led Elizabeth to a quiet corner table. They sat in awkward silence until Elizabeth spoke. "You know, I was a waitress when I met James's father," she said, surprising Sarah. "He wasn't wealthy then, just a young engineer with big dreams. But his family came from money, and they treated me exactly how people are treating you now." Sarah listened, curious despite herself. The whispers, the accusations, the constant scrutiny. "I know exactly how it feels," Elizabeth continued. "I almost left him because of it, but he fought for me, just like James is fighting for you." "James is fighting for me?" Elizabeth smiled softly. "He turned down Silicon Valley. He's been working on something else instead. Have you seen the news lately?" Sarah shook her head. She'd been actively avoiding all news since the breakup. "He's using his influence to push for privacy law reforms. He's speaking out against media harassment of private citizens. He's doing it all for you, even though you're not together." Sarah felt tears forming in her eyes. "I didn't know." "There's more," Elizabeth continued. "He bought this building." "What?" Sarah looked around the cafe in surprise. "He bought it to protect you. The new lease agreement for all businesses in this building includes strict rules against photography and media harassment. He didn't tell you because he didn't want you to think he was interfering in your life." Sarah sat back, overwhelmed. While she'd been hiding from the world, James had been trying to change it for her. "Why are you telling me this?" Sarah asked quietly. Because my son is miserable without you, Elizabeth replied honestly. And judging by the way your hands haven't stopped shaking since I mentioned his name, you're miserable without him too. It's not that simple, Sarah protested. His world? His world is whatever he chooses it to be, Elizabeth interrupted. And he chooses you. The question is, are you brave enough to choose him back? Elizabeth stood up, placing a small envelope on the table. James is hosting a charity gala for the foundation tomorrow night. The one that's helping your mother. This is an invitation, if you want it. As Elizabeth walked toward the door, she turned back one last time. You know, Sarah, sometimes the hardest part of loving someone isn't dealing with the outside world. It's overcoming our own fears. After Elizabeth left, Sarah sat staring at the envelope for a long time. She thought about James fighting battles she didn't even know about, protecting her even after she pushed him away. She thought about her mother, who was getting stronger every day thanks to the treatment James had made possible. Finally, she opened the envelope. Inside was an elegant invitation and a handwritten note from James. I understand why you left, but I want you to know that I would trade all my wealth, all my success, everything I have, just to see you smile again. If you come tomorrow night, we can face the world together. If you don't, I'll understand. But know that my heart will always belong to the girl who hugged the wrong person in a train station. James. Sarah pressed the note to her chest, her decision already made. Sometimes love means being brave enough to face your fears. Sometimes it means trusting that the heart knows better than the head. And sometimes it means going to a charity gala to find your way back home. The night of the charity gala arrived, and Sarah stood in front of her mirror, hardly recognizing herself. Elizabeth had sent over a simple but elegant black dress and a professional stylist. Her dark hair fell in soft waves, and the dress fit her perfectly, elegant but not flashy, exactly her style. As the taxi approached the venue, Sarah's heart pounded. Photographers lined the entrance, their cameras flashing. For a moment, she considered telling the driver to turn around, but then she remembered Elizabeth's words about being brave. Taking a deep breath, Sarah stepped out of the taxi. The cameras immediately turned to her, but something was different. Security personnel quickly formed a path for her, keeping the photographers at a respectful distance. No one shouted questions. No one invaded her space. Inside the grand ballroom, hundreds of people in formal wear mingled and chatted. Sarah scanned the crowd, looking for James. Instead, she found her mother standing near a column, looking healthy and beautiful in a navy blue gown. "Mom?" Sarah gasped. "What are you doing here?" James arranged everything. Her mother smiled. "The doctors cleared me to attend. I'm feeling stronger every day, thanks to the treatment." Before Sarah could respond, the room fell quiet as James took the stage. He looked handsome in his tuxedo, but Sarah could see the tiredness in his eyes, the slight strain in his smile. "Thank you all for coming tonight," James began. "This foundation was created to help families facing medical crises. But recently, I learned something important about help. It's not just about money. It's about dignity. It's about treating people with respect." His eyes scanned the room, then stopped when they found Sarah. For a moment, he seemed to forget his speech. "Sometimes," he continued, his voice softer, "the people who need help the most are the ones least willing to ask for it. They're afraid of judgment, of being seen as taking advantage. But true giving comes with no strings attached, no judgments, no expectations." Sarah felt tears forming in her eyes as James continued to speak about the foundation's work, about respecting privacy, about treating everyone with dignity regardless of their background. After the speech, as the crowd dispersed for dinner, James made his way through the room toward Sarah. People tried to stop him for conversations, but he politely excused himself, his eyes never leaving her. When he reached her, they stood in silence for a moment, taking each other in. "You came," he finally said. "Your mother can be very persuasive," Sarah replied with a small smile. "Sarah, I—" "Wait," she interrupted. "Let me speak first." She took a deep breath. "I was scared, not of the cameras or the headlines, but of not being enough, of changing who I am to fit into your world." "I never wanted you to change," James said quietly. "I know that now. I see what you've been doing. Changing things from your end, fighting battles I didn't even know about. You didn't try to change me. You tried to change the world that was hurting me. James reached for her hand, and this time, Sarah didn't pull away. I can't promise the attention will completely go away, he said honestly. But I can promise to always fight for your privacy, your dignity, your right to be exactly who you are. Sarah looked around the ballroom, at her healthy mother chatting with Elizabeth, at the respectful distance the photographers maintained, at the other foundation beneficiaries enjoying a night of dignity and celebration. I was wrong to run away, she admitted. Love isn't about avoiding difficulties, it's about facing them together. James pulled her closer. Does this mean you're willing to try again? Instead of answering, Sarah stood on her tiptoes and kissed him, right there in front of everyone. Cameras flashed in the distance, but for the first time she didn't care. When they pulled apart, James rested his forehead against hers. You know, for someone who accidentally hugged me in a train station, you sure took your time coming back for another hug. Sarah laughed, a real, joyful laugh that made several people turn and smile. Well, Mr. Whitaker, I plan to make up for lost time. As the orchestra began to play, James led Sarah to the dance floor. They had faced their fears, overcome their doubts, and found their way back to each other. Sometimes the greatest love stories aren't about perfect beginnings, but about having the courage to try again. 1 year later, Sarah stood in front of a different kind of crowd. Instead of photographers and socialites, she faced a line of eager customers waiting for the grand opening of the Accidental Hug Cafe. The name made her smile every time she saw it on the storefront. The cafe was her dream come true, a perfect blend of modern and cozy, with warm wood accents and large windows letting in natural light. Each table had a small card sharing the story of how an accidental hug in Grand Central Station led to love and a coffee shop. James stood beside her, holding the scissors for the ribbon-cutting ceremony. He had insisted on being here, despite having an important board meeting scheduled for the same morning. Ready? He asked, squeezing her hand. Sarah nodded, and together they cut the ribbon. The crowd cheered as the doors opened for the first time. James's mother Elizabeth was first in line, followed by Sarah's mother, who was now cancer-free and radiant with health. The cafe quickly filled with customers, and Sarah moved behind the counter, where she felt most at home. She had hired and trained an excellent staff, but today she wanted to make the first drinks herself. As she worked, she caught glimpses of the life she and James had built together. The foundation's office was right upstairs, where they helped families facing medical crises. The media had eventually lost interest in their story, thanks to James's continued efforts to protect their privacy, though occasionally someone would recognize them and ask about the hug story. Their relationship had grown stronger through every challenge. James still drove his Honda most days, though he had finally convinced Sarah to let him buy her a car too. They lived in a comfortable but modest apartment, saving the luxury penthouses for foundation fundraisers instead. As the morning rush continued, Sarah noticed a young woman hugging a stranger by mistake near the cafe's entrance. Both parties looked embarrassed, but then they saw the cafe's name and story on the wall. They laughed, and the young woman ended up buying coffee for the stranger she had hugged. History repeating itself. James whispered in Sarah's ear, having noticed the scene too. Maybe we should make it a promotion, Sarah joked. Hug a stranger, get a free coffee. I think our lawyers might have something to say about that, James laughed. By afternoon, when the crowd had thinned, Sarah finally took a break. She sat with James at their favorite corner table, the same spot where she had talked with Elizabeth a year ago. Happy? James asked, watching her survey her cafe with pride. More than I ever thought possible, Sarah replied. She touched the simple engagement ring on her finger. James had proposed last month, on the anniversary of their first meeting. You know, James said thoughtfully, most people spend their lives trying to avoid mistakes, and my favorite mistake was wearing a navy coat with brown elbow patches that day in Grand Central Station. And mine was being too excited to double-check if it was really my brother, Sarah added with a smile. Just then, Sarah's actual brother David walked in, wearing the famous navy coat that had started it all. He had moved back to New York and now worked for the Foundation's outreach program. Still can't believe my old coat led to all this, David said, joining them at the table, though I maintained that James's coat was a cheap knockoff of mine. They all laughed, knowing that the coat had become a running family joke. James had even worn it to propose, saying he wanted to come full circle. As the afternoon sun streamed through the windows, Sarah looked around at her cafe, at the happy customers, at her family gathered nearby, at the man she loved sitting beside her. Life hadn't turned out anything like she planned, but it had turned out better than she could have dreamed. Ready to get back to work? James asked, seeing more customers arriving. Always, Sarah smiled, standing up. Though no more hugging strangers. I already found my billionaire. And I found my coffee girl, James replied, kissing her cheek before heading upstairs to his foundation office. Sarah returned to her place behind the counter, happy in the knowledge that sometimes the best things in life start with a mistake, and sometimes an accidental hug can lead to an intentional forever. The end.